Psychodynamic therapy is the theoretical framework behind psychoanalysis, which was originally developed by the infamous Sigmund Freud in the beginning of the 20th century. It was developed as a way to start understanding the human mind. If you can imagine, back then, our understanding or the popular perspective behind the human mind was rather limited. It was used back then to start treating hysteria, which is something that we now call mental disorders or mental illnesses. Essentially, people struggling with their mental health. Side note, I like to imagine in a century or two what we'll be thinking about psychotherapy today. Over the past century or so, psychodynamic theory and psychoanalysis has evolved and there have been variations, but a lot of it has also stayed the same. Psychodynamic theory considers the root of our suffering, our mental health challenges, to be caused by conflicts in our unconscious mind. And if we can reduce that conflict, that is, if we can make what is unconscious conscious, then we can relieve suffering.
Hell yeah, dude. Now we know.
Now that's an important note. In psychodynamic theory, making unconscious conscious is known as insight. To achieve insight in psychodynamic theory, various tasks are used by the therapist with the client, and these include free association, interpretation, dream analysis, and an analysis of transference. Now, another important note in psychodynamic theory is that the therapist takes a very neutral stance towards the client and the client's conflicts. My name is Stuart, and I'm a registered social worker delivering psychotherapy services in private practice. And that beginning segment was psychodynamic therapy in a nutshell. But in this video, I'm going to dive deeper into this theoretical framework and approach to therapy. And it's also a part of a series I'm starting where I'm going through what can be argued the 9 fundamental approaches to psychotherapy. We're going to talk about the history of psychodynamic therapy, including Sigmund Freud and how he came to discover and create and sort of form psychoanalysis. We're going to talk about the rationale behind psychodynamic therapy. We're going to talk about the goals in psychodynamic therapy. We're going to talk about change processes, so how change happens for the client in psychodynamic therapy. We're going to talk about change tasks. So those are the specific tasks that the therapist and client do together in order to create change. We're going to talk about the therapeutic relationship between therapist and client, and then also go over how this therapy and theory has evolved and the variations that are still around and continue to be used today. Every therapist and approach to therapy is in some way indebted to Sigmund Freud, who kind of pioneered and is the key figure who developed psychoanalysis. It is difficult, however, to really summarize Freud's approach, and it's difficult for 2 main reasons. Reason number 1 is that his writings spanned over 45 years and they were constantly being revised. And there was no internet back then. This was all done with pen and paper. Reason number 2 is that Freud was actually far more interested in being a scientist. That's what he set out to do. He didn't want to necessarily be a therapist. He wanted to study the brain. In fact, Freud was a part of a group of scientists who were trying to explain psychoanalysis purely through biological processes. And there's actually a 3rd reason that I like to throw in there. Freud loved cocaine.
Dr. B, so what did Sigmund Freud say about cocaine?
What did Sigmund Freud say about cocaine? And this goes back to the idea that I introduced in another video. Sigmund Freud was really the first to introduce cocaine to the West and modern world. And he said something to the effect that I take it in small doses regularly to guard against depression and indigestion. And keep in mind, at that time, these guys were like rock stars. And when Sigmund Freud says something like that, well, everyone's going to start trying out cocaine to guard against depression and indigestion. And in some senses, this makes cocaine the first antidepressant, when you're not really depressed, in the history of the modern world.
But that's just a side note. I think it can be argued that in today's world, we're pretty much all high on caffeine.
I'm already on my 2nd cup.
This is my 3rd.
Captain, how do you feel?
Great, excellent, amazing. I feel better than I've ever felt in a moment in my entire life.
So we're all fine.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. Yep.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Now, these reasons that make it difficult to summarize Freud's approach are perhaps why Freud is so controversial today. He was controversial back in his time, but much more so today, especially on his theories on the nature of the mind and child development. Now, it's really easy to dismiss Freud today, especially in contemporary psychology classes. He's usually almost sort of laughed at, but I think it's really important that you really need to bring yourself back to Freud's time.
Seatbelts, everyone! Please let this be a normal field trip. With a friend? No way!
Because the common views back then on how people understood mental health and what we call mental disorders was that people had demons in them, or that they just had a weakness of character, or they had more physical reasons like lesions. Now, I'm not saying I'm a big fan of Freud or that I use his approach in my own therapy practice, but what I really appreciate about him and have come to appreciate is that he was a system disruptor, sort of like a punk of his time. What Freud and others he was working with did in that time was usher in the psychological paradigm. And I think everyone in the therapy space today, whether you're a therapist or client, can appreciate that there was that shift in perspective. And because Freud was so passionate about this shift in perspective, he did a lot of traveling to try and learn and understand how he could better help people who were experiencing what we refer to as mental health challenges or psychological disorders. I like to sometimes daydream about what it would have been like for someone like Freud back then to be in a therapist role, but not have any sort of theoretical framework guiding your work. It almost seems like improv. However, I suspect he thought very highly of himself, so perhaps it wasn't as anxiety provoking as it would have been for someone like me. As Freud embarked on this journey and travels, he met Jean-Martin Charcot, who at the time was using hypnosis to try and help his patients with their mental health. Now, Freud did become intrigued by this. He learned about it and tried to understand it. He used it with his patients, but he soon found that it had limited success. Now, Freud continued his journey and soon met up with Joseph Breuer and became friends with him and was very intrigued by Joseph's success in treating what was then called hysteria. Now, Freud was especially impressed with the now famous client or case example, Anna O. Now, Anna O, her real name was Bertha Pappenheim, and I'm actually professionally indebted to her, as after being treated with Joseph Breuer and making a lot of change in herself, she went on to become a prolific author, a feminist, a social activist, and pioneered a lot of the foundation of social work. Now, it was right around this time that Freud developed the now famous technique called free association. Free association is sort of that old school classic view most of us have when we think about, especially like old school therapy, where the client is laying on a couch, perhaps with their eyes closed.
Should I lay down?
Oh, no, we don't do that anymore.
But free association is when the client lays there and just spontaneously says whatever comes to their mind, while the doctor, the therapist, is in a neutral stance, taking notes and writing it down. Now, it was around this time that Freud, in my opinion, based on my own perspectives towards mental health, came to his senses and started moving away from an objective view and perspective of people's mental health and their mind and moved more towards the subjective. Like any good therapist, in my biased opinion and perspective, Freud was heavily influenced by classical Greek philosophy and other philosophy at the time. Now, I actually made a video fairly recently that you can check out here discussing how we define mental health and why it's difficult due to the subjective nature inherent with it, but how we often try to objectively look at it or define it. Now that we got the history out of the way, and I want to stress that was a very brief summary, but let's talk about the rationale behind psychodynamic therapy. Psychodynamic therapy is based on the premise that a satisfying and useful life comes from being honest with oneself. That is much easier said than done, as it's fairly easy and common to experience cognitive dissonance where our beliefs don't match up with our actions. Now, in my view and perspective, this is so true in today's world of the digital age, where people can set up their social media accounts and portray to the world this perfect, happy life, while inside themselves, their internal state, they're experiencing a lot of suffering. And from a psychodynamic view, that person is not being honest with themselves.
If two conflicting ideas are deeply ingrained in our identity, the mental imbalance can become overwhelming and intoxicate our thoughts. And as a result, we may believe even the most absurd conspiracy theories. To keep our sanity, it helps to learn about this phenomenon, known as cognitive dissonance.
Freud's classical analytical formulation argued that our unconscious, primitive, and illogical impulses have to be expressed in modified forms if we are to live comfortably within society. This is like how we have to follow social norms by living in, certain cultures and societies, even though we still have like a cave person's brain with very primitive biological impulses and instincts.
Is this thing loaded?
It can be.
We're still technically cave people that want to do cave people things. Now, the psychodynamic rationale perspective suggests that this battle creates anxiety within us. And in order to satisfy that anxiety, we need to modify our behaviors and our impulses in ways that are socially acceptable and fall in line with what society dictates of what is acceptable behavior. And it shapes the sense of who we are. And when we can manage it well, we can experience a greater sense of well-being, and we can live a sort of happier, symptom-free life. But when we struggle with it and don't address it and sort of ignore it or repress it, that is, from a psychodynamic rationale and perspective, that is where our suffering can start to increase, and that is where we can start developing things like what we call psychological disorders or neuroses. Nowadays, we see extreme examples of this all the time. People like serial killers who end up being locked in maximum security institutions are experiencing the sort of extreme end of this struggle and have an inability to modify their behavior. So the psychodynamic rationale wants us to strengthen our conscious minds through logical, rational self-understanding to increase everyday flexibility. I can really appreciate this rationale. I recently made a video about how we define mental health, which really stresses that flexibility part. Now, that was a quick summary of the rationale of psychodynamic therapy, which started to lead into the actual goals in this approach to therapy, which are to make things in our minds that are unconscious become more conscious. However, as you can imagine, this is very subjective. This is very difficult to do with certainty. How do you actually know what is unconscious, especially when we know that humans do not have the greatest memories? But a big goal of psychodynamic therapy is to try to understand ourselves, to better understand ourselves, and how we will relate with ourselves. And it is through this logical, rational self-understanding that we can become less rigid in the way we think and live, and become much more flexible to open up new possibilities for living. Psychodynamic therapy aims to broaden our organization of our experience so that we can make more effective, rational, and realistic life choices as we continue our journey in life. And it can help us lead lives that are both satisfying and socially responsible. We do live in society after all, and there are rules we have to follow. In psychodynamic therapy, a goal is to have anxiety become tolerable. This falls very closely with an existential framework that argues that, anxiety is part of being a human because life is very ambiguous and we are constantly faced with choices that we don't know the end result of until we make those choices and act them out. And so a goal of psychodynamic therapy is to better help people face the ambiguity inherent in both life and existence. Psychodynamic therapy acknowledges that life happens. We suffer, we watch people close to us suffer. Life has traumatic events for all of us on various levels, and we watch that play out all around us. But the goal in psychodynamic therapy is that we can experience that misery or depression or suffering in a quote unquote normal way rather than in a rational way. So we just talked about the goals in psychodynamic therapy, but how does one actually achieve those goals? And that's what this section is about, is on the change processes in psychodynamic therapy. And this process in psychodynamic therapy is commonly referred to as insight.
The prophecy is true.
Insight is achieved by making connections between seemingly unconnected aspects of our own life experiences. Now, this falls closely in line with the existential framework of therapy. And there is a quote, I'm going to say it wrong or pronounce it slightly not right, but Soren Kierkegaard is famous for saying, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Our ability to make connections, meaningful connections between life events is constantly changing because we are constantly having new life experiences that are shaping who we are and our ability to process and make those connections. A common example of making this connection is noticing a sort of what we consider a negative character trait or personality trait about ourselves that we also see in a family member. And almost like a detective, we can go back and see how we may have developed that in ourselves as the parent or family member had modeled it for us for so many years. It's important to note in psychodynamic therapy that back in Freud's day, insight was thought to be exclusively responsible for change to happen. However, there has been a plethora of research into psychotherapy itself that continues to show the importance of the therapeutic relationship or the therapeutic alliance, and that's the relationship between the client and the therapist. And in the research, this relationship is shown to be one of the biggest predictors of change for a client in therapy. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the summary, that the therapist in psychodynamic therapy takes a very neutral stance. And I would imagine someone like Freud, who was becoming almost like famous and perhaps having his own ego sort of blown up, would have almost a condescending demeanor towards his patients, especially if they were of a lower class than him. Now, this is an assumption I'm making. However, there are some controversies over Freud's lifetime and the work he did, as some of his clients did end up committing suicide. And it is often argued it was based on that relationship and specifically some of the stuff Freud was saying to his clients that were so upsetting. But I think it can be appreciated that psychodynamic therapy's stress on insight has really helped shape psychotherapy. I think a lot at some point in therapy, clients will eventually have almost like a light bulb moment, if not many, where they make that connection where, oh, that's why I do that thing. Or something like, oh, I never thought about it that way. I personally value this stress on insight as I did an undergrad in philosophy, and Socrates famously said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think psychotherapy can be a very effective way for people to examine their lives. So up until this point, we now understand that psychodynamic therapy wants us to achieve insight. But this is building off of the goals section. We're going to talk about the change tasks, the sort of interventions used. And I will touch on the 4 main tasks that psychodynamic therapists and clients work together on in psychodynamic therapy to achieve change or insight. Now, the first one, the one I mentioned in the history, is free association, which is that sort of classical view, client laying down on the couch, maybe their eyes are closed, therapist is sitting off to the side, not even looking directly at the client, having a neutral stance, and the client is just spontaneously saying whatever comes to their minds. The therapist tries to remain unbiased as best they can, and they are trying to understand on a deeper level the client's unconscious mind. The second change task is interpretation, which is when the therapist verbalizes their understanding of what the client has said or is saying. That's important in any approach to therapy, to make sure that the therapist does in fact understand what the client was trying to say or communicate, because ultimately they're trying to express something subjectively, and it is easy to misunderstand or misinterpret. The third change task, which Freud was really big on, is dream analysis. In psychodynamic therapy, the therapist treats the client's dreams very similar to how they would treat the client's symptoms. The idea here is that while we are dreaming, our unconscious mind is sort of weakened. And in psychodynamic therapy, dreams allow the therapist to better understand the client's unconscious conflicts. This may seem very odd or peculiar, especially if you've been a client in therapy. I doubt you've done any sort of dream analysis. Perhaps you have, but usually that's not part of a popular nowadays approach to therapy. And it's also a little odd as well, because despite the advances neuroscience and the study of the brain have made up until today, scientists really don't understand dreams. However, what I find really interesting about this and sort of revolutionary is that aspects of this are being practiced today, and especially more so now with the rise of psychedelic therapy. I can see a very close parallel here, because psychedelic therapy, where people ingest a psychedelic substance like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, things like that, that can help weaken somebody's unconsciousness and allow them to sort of open up more and share more, or even tap into more of what they are usually unconscious of. And perhaps now that psychedelic therapy has made a return into the research world and is becoming more widely accepted, it will be able to achieve in a much shorter time the goals that psychodynamic therapy had. And now the fourth change task in psychodynamic therapy is analysis of transference. This is actually very common in most approaches to therapy, especially nowadays. It's at least something that a therapist is paying attention to. But the point of it in psychodynamic therapy and why it's used as a change task is that it can help facilitate insight for the client into their interpersonal relationship with their therapist and understand some of the client's motives and feelings towards the therapist. Now, the point of analysis of transference in psychodynamic therapy and why it's used as a change task is to help the client gain insights into their interpersonal relationship with their therapist. It can help bring insight into their thoughts and feelings towards that interpersonal relationship, how they feel towards their therapist, what they think about their therapist. And that insight can potentially also be used to gain more insight into other interpersonal relationships that the client has in their life. Now it's time to talk about the therapeutic relationship in psychodynamic therapy. Now, throughout this video, I've alluded to the therapeutic relationship, and essentially the therapist has a very sort of benevolent manner towards the client. It's important to keep in mind that during Freud's time and the rise of psychodynamic therapy and psychoanalysis is that there was no research being done on the specific therapeutic alliance or the the therapeutic relationship within psychotherapy. In psychodynamic therapy, there is a term called analytic neutrality. This is considered to be essential in psychodynamic therapy so that the client's experience is not sort of contaminated or biased by the therapist. And the reason for that is to try and avoid the client's experience being in some ways contaminated or influenced by the therapist. I don't know if you've ever been around a really happy, bubbly person or like a group of people who are super positive go-getters, and you may notice how that can sort of influence you. You may start to adopt that sort of attitude. And the opposite is true if you're around someone who's severely depressed, especially around them a long time, or around a group of people who are sort of really down and miserable, that can really influence your own thoughts and feelings. And so in psychodynamic therapy, the therapist tries really hard and tries to be very aware of not influencing the client. Another aspect of the therapeutic relationship in psychodynamic therapy is countertransference. Now, most therapists are thinking about or aware on some level of countertransference, no matter what approach they're using in therapy, because it is an ongoing analysis and awareness of the therapist's undesirable view of the clients and that view being transferred over to the client. This can happen in really subtle ways if the therapist is becoming frustrated with the client's lack of perceived effort or their lack of goals that they're making in therapy. Certain approaches in therapy might have certain expectations of where the client should be based on how many sessions they've had. And so when therapists do clinical supervision where they meet with another therapist, usually more experienced and seasoned, to anonymously discuss a client, they will be discussing aspects of countertransference to see if it's apparent. Unfortunately, countertransference can even be sort of a part of an approach to therapy, especially sort of pseudoscientific approaches to therapy. It's most apparent in therapists or approaches to therapy who consider that their approach and how they do therapy is the right approach and the only approach. And so if the client isn't making progress, the client is blamed rather than the approach or therapist. So the last part that I wanted to touch on this What is Psychodynamic Therapy video is the evolution and variations that have come out since psychodynamic was first started. Psychodynamic therapy does still influence the whole therapy world today. It influences therapists, it influences approaches to therapy, and influences new frameworks and theories that get developed. However, it is a lot less popular with current time therapists than it would have been with previous generations of therapists. So I'm going to touch on 5 different variations or evolutions of psychodynamic therapy. I'll give sort of in a nutshell of what they are. And if you want to know more about them, I suggest doing your own sort of research, but that would be a video in and of itself on each of these variations. So the first popular variation of psychodynamic therapy is ego psychology. So ego psychology varied from psychodynamic because instead of just looking at childhood experiences and studying that, psychologists began studying child development itself. And this allowed for a different understanding on the role of childhood development and how it impacts and influences a person's life. Another variation is object relations therapy. This is considered an important variation because up until object relations therapy, the approach and area of study had been fundamentally rational. Self-psychology was another important evolution from psychodynamic therapy. And one of the things that really set it apart from psychodynamic therapy and continues to influence therapy and therapists today is that it brought in a humanistic approach. Humanism and a humanistic approach has influenced most of, if not all, of the therapies practiced today. Brief psychodynamic therapy is another evolution and variation that has occurred and is still used today. And it's not just because we live in a quick fix culture and people don't want to spend years laying on a couch talking about their childhood. The brief psychodynamic therapy is an important variation because as therapists and researchers studied psychodynamic therapy, they were able to see that the approach was still effective when it was more flexible and less rigid, and clients were still able to reach their goals in fewer sessions. And the last evolution or variation I'll touch on is psychodynamic family therapy. This variation argued that our problems as individuals arise and are maintained from our interpersonal relationships with significant people in our lives, which are typically family members. I think this variation applies even more so in today's world, where family has 24/7 access to each other through digital means. And when people have toxic or unhealthy interpersonal relationships, especially with their family, and 24/7 access, it can significantly reduce their well-being and cause a lot of challenges in their life. So thank you for watching my brief breakdown, sort of psychodynamic therapy in a nutshell. This is going to be part of a series I'm creating, and I'll be going through 8 more sort of fundamental approaches to psychotherapy. One of the reasons I'm even creating this content is that it helps me personally develop a deeper understanding. I think there's a saying, the best way to learn something is to teach it. So I'm sort of testing that out for myself.
Because those that can't do, teach. And those that can't teach Jim.
If you found it valuable or hopefully insightful, feel free to subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified of new videos and content that I'm creating. Like the quote I mentioned earlier from Kierkegaard, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. I think that applies to the world of psychotherapy. So this is sort of me going backwards in hopes of improving my future.